The government did not try to stop him quickly. They did not send assassins. They did not start a war. They chose something slower, something harder to notice. They chose time. This story does not end with a gunshot. It ends with waiting, and waiting was enough to erase a man who once controlled Harlem. Long before prison bars closed around him, Bumpy Johnson understood one truth better than most people ever do. Power does not always fall when it is attacked. Sometimes it disappears when it is ignored long enough. That lesson would define how the government dealt with him and how his story would end. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born into a world where rules were strict, but protection was uneven. He grew up in the American South, in a time when the law existed clearly on paper, but often failed in practice. As a child, he learned early that authority did not mean safety. It meant distance. It meant silence. That silence became real when his older brother was killed after a confrontation with a white man. The law responded, but not with justice. There was no outcome that restored balance, no punishment that felt equal, just procedure followed by quiet. For a young boy watching this, the lesson was not anger, it was clarity. The law could see you and still decide not to protect you. That moment did not turn him into a criminal. It turned him into an observer. He began to watch how power actually worked, not how it was described. He noticed who was protected, who was ignored, and who survived by understanding the difference. When he was sent north to Harlem, the move was not about opportunity. It was about escape. Harlem in the early 20th century was alive with sound and ambition. Music flowed through open windows. Culture filled the streets. But behind that energy was pressure. Jobs were limited, housing was crowded, and trust in authority was thin. Police were present, but rarely helpful. When trouble came, response was slow or careless. People learned to solve problems on their own, not because they wanted to break the law, but because waiting for help often made things worse. Ellsworth arrived quietly. He did not try to stand out. He spoke little and listened carefully. He left school early, but he never stopped learning. He read history to understand patterns. He read poetry to understand silence. He studied people the way others studied maps. While others reacted emotionally to daily struggles, he watched behavior. Who talked too much? Who stayed calm? Who people turned to when fear entered a room? He noticed something important. Power did not belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the person who could end uncertainty. The nickname Bumpy came from something small and physical, almost meaningless, a bump on his head. At first, it was a joke. Over time, the joke disappeared. The name remained. People began to associate it with something else. When Bumpy was nearby, problems did not grow. They stopped. This was not kindness. It was reliability. Harlem's underground economy did not exist because people enjoyed crime. It existed because legal systems excluded too many. The numbers game was illegal, but it paid rent. It fed families. It created structure where none existed. This system needed order. It needed discipline. It needed enforcement that did not draw attention. Bumpy Johnson became useful because he understood limits. He did not overreact. He did not seek attention. He handled matters quietly and left space behind him. People trusted him not because he was gentle, but because he was predictable. Predictability is safety when everything else is uncertain. As the years passed, his influence grew without announcement. He did not declare control. He did not claim territory publicly. Authority formed around him because people expected results when he was involved. Disputes ended. Boundaries were respected. Violence was rare, but understood. This was the moment Harlem began to trust something other than the law. The turning point did not arrive with a single act of violence. It arrived when outsiders noticed Harlem's money. Organized crime figures from outside the neighborhood saw profit, not balance. They brought force without understanding. They did not care about the fragile order that already existed. This forced a decision that could not be avoided. Bumpy Johnson could step back and allow chaos to return, or he could enforce the rules himself. He chose enforcement. That choice was irreversible. From that moment on, his role changed. He was no longer just a stabilizer. He became a barrier. Violence followed, but it was controlled, targeted, purposeful. Harlem watched closely. Disorder was punished. Lines were redrawn. The message was clear. If the law would not protect the neighborhood, someone else would. Public reaction was quiet but decisive. People stopped calling the police. They stopped waiting. They adjusted. Media from outside Harlem often misunderstood what they saw. They reported crime. Harlem experienced order. This is where everything quietly changed. What looked like patience was not weakness. It was structure, but structure attracts attention. By the late 1940s, federal authorities began to look closely at Harlem. Gambling had been tolerated quietly for years. Narcotics changed everything. Drugs crossed borders. They attracted national attention. They demanded response. The government did not want a street war. They wanted something permanent. Removing one man would not be enough. They wanted to dismantle the system itself. That required time. They watched. They documented. They waited. Bumpy Johnson felt the pressure long before the arrest. Meetings became shorter. Conversations quieter. Trust narrowed. He understood that the federal government did not move like local police. When they came prepared. Stepping away was impossible. The system depended on him. Leaving would invite chaos. Staying meant exposure. The choice had already been made. This was the real point of no return. He believed prison would be the danger. He was wrong. Because prison was not designed to break him quickly. It was designed to remove him long enough for everything else to change. The indictment came in 1951, calm and precise. There was no drama, no chase. Bumpy Johnson did not run. He appeared in court, knowing this was not a fight he could win with force or reputation. The courtroom did not care who he was to Harlem. It cared who he was connected to. The conviction was not loud. 15 years in federal prison was not a punishment meant to shock. It was meant to erase, slowly. From the moment the cell door closed, the waiting began. And while he waited, Harlem moved on.
Prison does not break a man all at once. It takes small pieces over time, quietly, without warning. When the cell door closed behind Bumpy Johnson in the early 1950s, there was no sense of finality, no dramatic ending, just a long stretch of time that no one could see the end of. That was the point. The government did not need to announce victory. They had already achieved something more valuable. They had removed him from the environment that made him powerful. Everything else would happen on its own. Inside federal prison, the world became smaller. Days were measured, controlled, and repeated. There were no streets to read, no shifting alliances to sense, no problems to settle. Power that once depended on awareness now depended on memory, and memory fades when it is not refreshed. Bumpy Johnson understood prison quickly. He had seen what resistance did to men who chose the wrong battles. He did not challenge guards. He did not seek attention. He did not try to recreate influence inside walls that did not allow it. He stayed quiet. He watched. He adapted. He read constantly. Books filled the space that once belonged to movement. He wrote poetry, not for display, but for order. Writing was a way to slow time, to give shape to days that otherwise blurred together. Silence became routine. Routine became survival. Outside those walls, Harlem did not stop. It adjusted. At first, the changes were subtle. Meetings still happened. The numbers game continued. People spoke his name with caution and respect, but decisions began to happen without waiting, not because of betrayal, but because delay no longer made sense. The man who once settled disputes was gone, and life had to move forward. This is how influence erodes. Not through violence, but through absence. Younger figures stepped into the space he left behind. Some tried to follow the old rules. Others did not understand them. The balance that once limited chaos depended on memory and restraint. Without guidance, restraint weakened. Arguments took longer to resolve. Violence did not disappear, but it became less controlled. Federal authorities watched all of this carefully. They were not surprised. This was exactly what time was supposed to do. Remove the stabilizing presence, and the system begins to expose itself. The goal was never peace. The goal was visibility. The narcotics trade did not shrink, it grew. New connections formed, routes shifted. Without a central negotiator, conflicts escalated more quickly. The kind of violence that draws attention returned slowly. The government did not rush in. They waited for the system to show itself. Bumpy Johnson received fragments of information through letters and visits. Nothing complete, nothing reliable. He knew Harlem was changing, but not how fast. Prison creates distance not just from place, but from relevance. By the time information arrives, decisions have already been made. For the first time in his life, Harlem was making choices without him. That was the real punishment. Years passed. Seasons changed beyond walls he could not see. Faces aged in photographs. Names he once knew disappeared from conversations. The respect attached to his name remained, but it no longer carried instructions. It became symbolic. Inside prison, he aged as well. The discipline that kept him alive also isolated him. Younger inmates did not know his history. To them, he was an older man who kept to himself. Respect existed, but it was passive. Influence does not survive without use. The government understood something important during these years. Killing a system creates martyrs. Martyrs inspire loyalty. Letting a system fade creates silence. Silence does not organize itself. By the late 1950s, the case against Bumpy Johnson no longer needed reinforcement. His continued absence was enough. Harlem had adapted to life without him. That adaptation could not be reversed. When he was finally released in the early 1960s, there was no announcement, no welcome committee, no signal that an era was returning. He stepped back into Harlem, older, thinner, and carrying a weight that did not show. The streets looked familiar. The rhythm felt different. People recognized him. Heads nodded. Conversations softened when he passed. Respect remained. But something else was missing. Authority. The unspoken pause that once followed his presence was gone. Harlem did not wait anymore. He understood this immediately. Power that depends on timing cannot survive lost time. The conditions that made him necessary had changed. Drugs were more visible. Violence was louder. Decisions were faster. The old balance had dissolved. He did not try to reclaim control. He did not call meetings. He did not test loyalty. He listened. He observed. He knew that forcing relevance would only invite conflict he could not win. Federal attention returned quietly. He was observed, not hunted. Questioned, not chased. The government no longer needed urgency. They had already proven their strategy worked. Health problems followed. Years of stress, confinement, and constant awareness had consequences. His heart weakened. Doctors warned him. But caution had never guided his life. He had lived under pressure for so long that it felt normal. Another investigation began to form. It was incomplete, but real. He recognized the pattern immediately. The slow gathering of information, the careful watching, the silence before movement. This time, there was no fear, only understanding. He knew the system no longer needed him urgently removed. He was no longer central. He was a reminder of something that no longer existed, a symbol of a past order, not a barrier to the present one. This was the final proof of the government's strategy. You do not need to destroy a man to end his influence. You only need to separate him from the conditions that made him powerful and wait long enough for those conditions to change. It was not justice, it was patience. What looked like inaction was control. By the time Bumpy Johnson realized that his role could not be restored, the ending no longer needed force. Time had already done its work. The waiting was nearly complete. Time does not announce its victory. It lets people believe nothing is happening while everything is changing. By the mid-1960s, Bumpy Johnson was alive, free, and walking the same streets he once influenced. But Harlem no longer paused when he passed. The city had learned how to move without him. When he returned after more than a decade in federal prison, there was no moment that marked his arrival. No gathering, no warning, no celebration. He stepped back into a neighborhood that remembered him, but no longer depended on him. Faces showed recognition, voices lowered out of habit. Respect remained, but control did not. The balance that once defined Harlem was gone. Violence was louder, drugs were more visible. Conflicts no longer waited for permission to end. The informal rules that once slowed chaos depended on memory, and memory had faded. Younger figures filled the space with speed instead of restraint. They did not know why the old rules existed. They only knew they were gone. Bumpy Johnson understood this immediately. He did not try to reclaim authority. He did not test loyalty or force meetings. He listened. He watched. He understood that power built on timing cannot survive lost time. The environment that once made him necessary had changed beyond repair. The balance that once defined Harlem was gone. Violence was louder, drugs were more visible. Conflicts no longer waited for permission to end. The informal rules that once slowed chaos depended on memory, and memory had faded. Younger figures filled the space with speed instead of restraint, authority. He did not test loyalty or force meetings. He listened. He watched. He understood that power built on timing cannot survive lost time. The environment that once made him necessary had changed beyond repair. This was the true cost of waiting. Not death, not defeat, irrelevance. Federal attention never fully disappeared. It changed shape. He was no longer hunted. He was observed, questioned quietly, watched from a distance. The government did not need urgency anymore. Their strategy had already worked. Health problems followed. Years of stress, confinement, and constant awareness had consequences. His heart weakened. Doctors warned him. But caution had never guided his life. He had lived under pressure for so long that it felt normal. Rest felt temporary. Another federal case began to form. It was incomplete, but real. He recognized the pattern immediately. The silence, the careful watching, the sense that time was being used again. This time, there was no fear, only understanding. He knew the government no longer needed him urgently removed. He was not holding anything together anymore. He was not blocking anything. He was a reminder of a past order, not a threat to the present one. On a summer evening in July 1968, he entered a small restaurant in Harlem. It was familiar, ordinary. He sat down alone and ordered coffee. There was no tension in the room, no argument, no sign that this moment would matter. People noticed him, but no one reacted. He was no longer a trigger. He was part of the background. Then it ended. There was no violence, no confrontation, no final warning. His heart failed quietly. Bumpy Johnson died seated upright, as if refusing to fall even at the end. The man the government once waited to defeat was gone without resistance. News spread, but without shock. Harlem did not erupt. There was no scramble for control, no sudden shift. The streets absorbed the absence the way they had absorbed many others. Life continued. He was buried among people who lived very different lives: politicians, artists, business leaders. In death, those distances mattered less than they had in life. He had always existed between worlds. Now he remained there permanently. What followed was not silence, but story. Memory began to change shape. Details softened. Motives became simpler. Popular culture stepped in where records ended. The man became a character. The character became a legend. Stories gave him clean lines and clear intentions. Reality had never been that clean. In stories, he ruled absolutely. In reality, he negotiated constantly. In stories, protection was rare. In reality, it was controlled, not removed. Myth is easier than truth. Myth does not need documents. It does not need balance. It only needs emotion. Harlem's memory held both gratitude and fear. Those emotions blended into respect. But records tell a harder story. They describe a man who did not fix injustice, but learned how to operate inside it. He did not end violence. He managed it. He did not bring justice. He brought predictability. For some, that predictability felt like safety. For others, it felt like pressure. Victims rarely appear in legends. They remain unnamed. Their absence is part of the cost.
The government did not defeat Bumpy Johnson with bullets or spectacle. They defeated him with time. By removing him long enough for the environment to change, they made him unnecessary. When he returned, there was nothing left to reclaim. This was the real lesson of the case. Informal power depends on conditions. Remove the man, change the conditions. Wait. It was not justice. It was strategy. And the strategy worked.
Harlem continued. The narcotics trade continued. Violence changed shape but did not disappear. The gap that once allowed one man to replace the law closed slowly, imperfectly, and at a cost. This story matters not because one man was powerful, but because so many people trusted him, not because he was feared, but because he was reliable when nothing else was. That trust did not come from legend. It came from absence. When protection fails, people do not wait for systems to recover. They find replacements. Those replacements can bring order, but they also create new harm. Temporary solutions become permanent, and permanence attracts attention. Bumpy Johnson did not plan to become a symbol. He responded to a vacuum. He filled it effectively. When the vacuum closed, the symbol remained, but the power did not. In the end, the government proved something unsettling. You do not need to destroy a man to end his influence. You only need to outlast him. They did not kill him. They waited. And waiting was enough.